What makes a good death in League of Legends? Dying is a constant factor in this game's experience and typically serves as a driving event for which one team can acquire a notable advantage against the other in a number of ways. Because of this, prevailing wisdom sees dying as a negative thing, detrimental to the team's performance. Consequently, the general consensus is that the less you die, the better. But are there moments where it's not only permissible to die, but actually worthwhile to do so? I'm not really known for guide videos, that market's already oversaturated as it is, but the more I thought about it, I figured this can make for an interesting thought piece, sort of like a half discussion, half guide video. Today we'll be discussing how deaths can be utilized to one's advantage and what factors determine if a death is a quote-unquote good or bad one. Now, dying is a normal part of the experience of playing League, but so is killing. I'm sure most of us prefer to score kills more than feed, and you probably want to share your best moments too, right? Well, you can do so with our sponsor for today, Outplayed. You may have heard of them before, but in case you haven't, Outplayed's a video capturing app that works for most if not all mainstream games out there, including League of Legends. You can automatically record kills, big team fights, outplays their funny moments, and turn them into highlights to upload and share whenever you want. The app comes with a built-in video editor, letting you fancy up any clips you capture to then post on Discord, YouTube, Twitter, Reddit, anywhere you feel like sharing. They work on just about any game too. You can use it for League, TFT, Valorant, or many other popular games. If you're a fan of recording clips, be sure to use my link on screen or in the description to download the app and start farming Reddit karma, Twitter likes, or Discord reactions. It's a cool app, I've used it myself a number of times and it's always a pleasure to be sponsored by Outplayed. For now though, let's get back to the video. What got me thinking about this initially were three things, one of which being back when Carus became popular in the jungle some time ago. Carus, as you know, is infamous for having arguably the best death passive in the game, wherein for a substantial amount of time afterwards he would be able to freely cast all of his abilities, including his powerful Requiem before he actually died. More often than not, he would be stronger when dead, as there would be no way for you to interrupt his ultimate, and since he's already dead, there would be no need for the player to care about his HP or positioning, and then can just focus on blasting anything within a 5-foot radius. Statistically, Carus ranks at the very top of all champions by average DPS per game, and unsurprisingly, he also ranks at the very top of all champions by average number of deaths per game. You tend to see Carus players intentionally suiciding into the enemy team to position themselves to carry even after being dead. The second thing was all the discourse around League's current most popular streamer, BossFFS, who on occasion draws a fair bit of controversy across Twitter for his unique habit of dying an inordinate number of times per game, while still applying massive amounts of pressure, skirting an incredibly fine line between tactical inting and actual inting. Personally, I think it's fine for him to do whatever the hell he wants. He's Challenger, Hearthstone Emerald players have no right to criticize him for what he's doing when their peak is Diamond 4 every season. That being said, it does beg the question, what's the difference between a good death and a bad one? In a given match, people tend to look at the player with the highest KDA as the most impactful member of the team, while the person with the lowest KDA is the least impactful member of the team, or in a loss case, the reason why their team lost the game. Thankfully over the years though, that sentiment has been gradually weaned off of and now shifted towards kill participation rather than KDA. For instance, a 5-1-3 score in a team with 40 kills might be less influential than a 12-6-18 score, even though it's an 8 KDA versus a 5, as the latter player has been involved in more fights and contributed more for their team. Context obviously matters when judging if a death is good or bad. Several things happen when a champion dies. Firstly, nearby opponents are rewarded experience, more if the champion has a kill streak and less if the champion has been inting. So contrary to popular belief, getting executed still provides value to the enemy team in the form of experience. Those who were involved in the death of said champion is then given a sum of gold, a base amount to the one who dealt the most recent hit before death, and a smaller amount distributed across all champions who assisted in that kill. Secondly, if the champion happened to possess a red and or blue buff, those buffs would be transferred over to the enemy champion who dealt the finishing blow, and any temporary buffs, such as Elder Dragon or Baron buff, would also be lost upon dying. This should be common knowledge to everyone. The real consequence of death goes beyond the gold experience and potential buffs the enemy champion acquires. More crucially, when you die, you're no longer present on the map, resulting in a loss of pressure for your team. In several videos now, I brought up the concept of pressure in the form of percentages, with every team member on both sides opening up with 20% each. Scoring a kill on an enemy champion steals pressure away from them and adds it to yours, say 2% per kill for the sake of argument. This is because the killer has a golden experience lead over you, making your pressure against them less effective and their pressure against you more effective. However, while the champion's dead, their pressure is temporarily set to 0, regardless of what they had while alive. While dead, barring the redemption item, you pose absolutely no threat to the enemy team, enabling them to conduct themselves on the map without fear of retaliation. In laning phase, the usual consequences of dying would go along the lines of falling further behind in golden experience due to enemy minions dying, falling behind in gold as a result of enemies taking tower plates or the tower itself, or falling behind elsewhere. It's important to understand that loss of pressure can have a ripple effect on the rest of your team, meaning not only do you fall behind, but so can others as a result of your death. In consideration of this, deaths are seldom if ever uniform in consequence. There might be moments where one death results in minimal negative consequence for your team, while at other times one death can be the single determining factor for your team losing the game. Most of the time, that's what separates a quote-unquote good or neutral death from a bad one. The simplest example of a good death would be if you find a good engage on the enemy team and dish out a ton of damage or crowd control before ultimately dying, but your engage results in 4 members of the enemy team dying, a 4 for 1. Players often say worth in response to this, believing that while their team suffered a casualty and therefore loss of pressure, the enemy team suffered more casualties and subsequently a greater loss of pressure, a net positive. Self-explanatory, your team has 4 champions alive while the enemy team has only 1. In which case, the pressure advantage you have is so great that unless that one player has the power of God and anime on their side, you can pretty much do anything you want around the map. A slightly more elaborate example would be a 1-for-1 exchange. Say your team's 1 in 5 top laner dies, but the skirmish results in the enemy 10 and 2 jungler dying. In most cases, this would be a good death, particularly in the mid to late game. Your Orienting top laner is contributing a lot less pressure than the enemy fed jungler is, but while you're dead, it doesn't matter if that jungler had 40% pressure, currently it's at 0. Moreover, being the jungler, the enemy team is now at a serious disadvantage if your team feels empowered to take Dragon or Baron due to the absence of Smite. Trading a less impactful member on your team for a more impactful member of the enemy team can therefore be considered a good death, despite not attaining a physical numbers advantage, 4v4 as opposed to a 5v5. The higher up you go, the more nuanced and intricate this becomes. Master, Grandmaster, and Challenger Elo players have a more developed eye for whether an exchange is a net positive for them, even if it results in their death. Without getting too deep into it, a less pronounced case study would be, for example, tower diving the enemy laner to score a kill on them. Even if both champions die, the enemy laner comes out worse from it because the wave crashed under their tower. Another one would be a spell pusher's death. If you're pushing the side lane opposite to whatever objective your team has eyes on, which would be bot lane for Baron or top lane for Elder Dragon, and the enemy team is forced to send 2 or even 3 members to shut you down, despite it being an over 1 with the enemy team having all 5 members alive, your team gets to do Baron without much resistance. There are multiple layers underneath all this, and the number of examples are quite literally unquantifiable. The flip side of things gets even more sophisticated, finding out what is a bad death. Alright, I think we can all agree that from an objective standpoint, dying's always a bad thing. While I just went over examples of what might be considered a quote-unquote good death, dying in and of itself is inherently a negative thing. A 4-for-1 is without question a good trade, but it would be even better if it was a 4-for-0. But just like in real life, aiming for a perfect outcome every time will cause you to never get anything done, which is why KDA players are the absolute worst. Freaking waste of oxygen averaging 10 plus KDA every game but have a negative win rate because they think kills mean everything and then they wonder why they're hard stuck. I digress though. What exactly would distinguish a bad death from like a bad death? First and foremost would be once again the loss of pressure, calling back to the aforementioned case of the 1 in 5 top lane and trading deaths with the 10 and 2 jungler. With all certainty, this would be a bad death for the jungler as the jungler had more pressure to lose than the top laner did. This also happens to be the basis for Boston's Law. The reason Babus can turbo feed games and still feel like he's the most threatening member of the team is because he manipulates the circumstances of his death to cause the least amount of loss for himself and simultaneously the least amount of gain for the opponent. One might think Boss executing himself while proxy farming is objectively bad given the enemy top laner gets to farm uncontested. That might be true on paper, but given Boss cleared like 3 waves in advance, the enemy laner isn't able to shove the wave because, well, there is no wave. Also, if he does happen to die to the enemy team, Boss takes advantage of Sion's death passive to still push the wave or get tower plates, salvaging the golden experience every other champion would have lost in the process. And then meanwhile, the enemy laner is becoming increasingly more and more valuable due to accumulating a bounty. Boss is keeping up in golden experience himself thanks to Sion's infinite scaling and having near perfect, if not over perfect CS. Ostensibly, it might appear that Boss is extremely behind seeing as he's like 0-5 while the enemy top lane is 5-0, but in reality they might only be up 1k in gold and maybe half a level at most, a practically negligible amount. In essence, Boss manipulates golden experience calculations to always make his deaths offer minimal reward to you, while making your deaths offer maximum reward to him. He attempts to create a lose-lose situation where if you don't kill him he gets to farm and scale and push and all that, but if you do kill him it only makes your deaths more catastrophic down the road. Which brings me to arguably my favorite example of a good or bad death, and also the third thing that got me thinking about making this video. One of the biggest points of contention within the League community is the idea of whose fault is it? I'm sure we've all encountered a situation like this before. You're playing a game and it's dead even. You have a super fed team member, they have a super fed team member. Long story short, your carry either gets out carried by the opposing carry, or they get caught out for one reason or another and your team loses the game. Where this becomes a point of contention is who is to truly blame for the loss of that game. Let's say it's the enemy mid laner versus your team's ADC. Is it the ADC's fault for getting caught out, in other words making the last mistake of the game, or is the mid laner at fault for getting the enemy mid laner fed in the first place, in other words the first mistake of the game? Actually, earlier this year I made a post about it and the results were a clean 2-1 in favor of the last mistake of the game. Again, it depends. Would the ADC's death have been nearly as consequential if their mid laner wasn't a complete idiot and turbo fed the enemy mid laner? Absolutely. However, I've always been on the side of the last mistake being more important. As such, while the mid laner being 3-12 certainly made the game a lot harder than it should have been, even if that one death was the ADC player's only death that happened at the most critical juncture in the game. In that sense, that one death was more consequential than the 12 deaths the mid laner had combined, as unintuitive and unreasonable as that may sound, since up until that one death, the game was still in a winnable position. When you're the carry, your deaths have a lot more weight than any of your team's deaths because you hold the most amount of pressure on your team. Let's assume the enemy team's pressure is 15, 23, 30, 25, 17, and on your team it's 16, 24, 9, 40, 11. Like I said, both teams are neck and neck. Now, even though any person getting caught and dying late game can be disastrous, your mid laner is already 3-12 and behind everyone to begin with. Losing 9% for your team doesn't sting nearly as much as losing 40% for that specific moment. You can see why League is such a frustrating game, right? Even though you played perfectly and your inting mid laner made the game so much more difficult than it had to be, the one time you made a mistake can be more damaging than the 12 deaths your mid laner had. Granted, League is a snowballing game. All mistakes carry equal weight if you really want to get technical about it, because any one of them could have started the snowball that led to your team's defeat, which to be fair is worth acknowledging. Repeating the argument in favor of the first mistake, if your mid laner died only 6 times instead of 12, the situation would have been less do or die and your team might have had a tangible lead to make use of. Or perhaps if your jungler didn't get caught out and make your team lose Baron, then you would have been in a much more favorable position in the late game. Like with anything, it depends. Is that always the case? No. Sometimes it really is the mid laner dying a 13th time that leads to a 4v5 ultimately losing the game, at which point you did everything you could do, your team was just too heavy. This hypothetical example is just to illustrate the magnitude of death pass on the game based on the current circumstance. The fed person with a 1k gold bounty dying would be more consequential than the inter who's worth less than a cannon minion. That's just how the game is designed. Overall, dying in League of Legends can at times not only be a good thing, but potentially the most optimal thing to do because pressure is more important than gold or experience or any amount of items you have. You can run it down a side lane rage splitting all game and be 0-10, and that might ironically be the reason you win the game because the enemy team's unable to navigate the rift without fear of getting backdoored. To be clear, I hope you guys don't take this video as an excuse to go 0-10 every game. There's a reason Boss's playstyle is so contentious. It skirts a razor-thin line between tactically feeding and actually feeding. If there's a way you can acquire advantage without having to give up your life, you should absolutely pursue that outcome first. Dying objectively is a bad thing, and all efforts should be made to minimize the number of deaths you have per game. At the same time, KDA isn't the be-all end-all, and there might be many games where the supposed feeder is the real MVP of the team. Understanding what makes a good or bad death is, in my opinion, a heavily underappreciated aspect of improving as a player, and like with most things in this game, it's a case-by-case basis. I think a lot of players fall into the trap of believing that whoever has the most deaths on the team is the one performing the worst, when in a lot of cases, they could be doing just as much for their team as someone with a higher KDA. It just might not be measured in a visually quantifiable way. You know what? I feel like I should make a video elaborating on the concept of pressure since I use that word so much. You guys remember that one random video that came out a few years ago on damage types and how it went viral and then the guy just disappeared off the face of the earth? I still wonder where he went. That was a really good video. But in any case, this was sort of an experimental episode on a new series I wanted to test out on the channel. Let me know in the comments down below if you thought this was helpful and if you think I should make more content like this. For now though, if you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe would be much appreciated. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other discussion videos if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.